Forensic artists have been putting more flesh on the bones of the story of Ötzi the Iceman. 20 years after Ötzi was found, Dutch experts Adria and Alphonse Kennis have reconstructed his face using CT scans and infrared images of his skull.
New scans are forcing scientists to confront an unsettling possibility about one of the most famous bodies ever found in ice. For decades, the story of Ötzi the Iceman seemed straightforward, a prehistoric traveler shot by an arrow who died quickly in the Alps over 5,000 years ago. But new forensic imaging and deeper analysis are challenging that narrative in disturbing ways. Evidence now suggests his final hours may have been far more violent, prolonged, and mysterious than previously believed. Even more controversial, some long-accepted assumptions about his identity, health, and the circumstances of his death are beginning to unravel under modern scientific analysis. The brutal discovery of Ötzi. Imagine the sheer, unforgiving hostility of the Ötztal Alps on September 19, 1991. You are standing at an elevation of 3,210 meters, surrounded by a frozen expanse that has remained largely unchanged for millennia. In an environment this extreme, the ice rarely surrenders its frozen dead willingly or without a fight. When ordinary hikers Helmut and Erika Simon stumbled across a body protruding from the glacial meltwater on the Tizenjok Pass, the immediate assumption was a tragedy, but a modern one. They believed they were looking at the decaying remains of a lost mountaineer, a recent victim of the treacherous peaks. How could anyone possibly anticipate that this frozen corpse predated the Great Pyramids of Giza and the construction of Stonehenge by entire centuries? Yet, what should have been the most meticulously handled archaeological recovery of the 20th century rapidly deteriorated into a horror story of institutional incompetence. Think about the absolute surgical precision you would expect when handling a fragile, priceless artifact from the Copper Age. Now picture the exact, horrifying opposite. Between September 19th and the 23rd, recovery teams approached this 5,300-year-old time traveler with the brutal urgency of a rescue mission rather than the delicate touch of a scientific exhumation. They descended upon the site wielding heavy pneumatic drills, crude ice axes, and even ski poles to violently chip away at the glacial tomb. The result was a catastrophic mishandling of an unprecedented historical treasure. In their frantic efforts to pry the frozen body from the ice, the recovery team accidentally shattered the left hip of the mummy. Even worse, they unceremoniously snapped his ancient yew longbow, a beautifully crafted weapon that had survived completely intact since the dawn of human civilization, only to be broken by modern carelessness. This chaotic exhumation was completely devoid of specialized archaeological oversight or basic scientific respect. The body was subjected to a haphazard extraction that compromised vital evidence before researchers even realized what they possessed. Adding to the sheer absurdity of the situation, a tense geopolitical squabble immediately ensued over the exact location of the high-altitude tomb. Subsequent land surveys eventually determined that the find spot lay exactly 92.56 meters inside Italian territory, decisively shifting the legal custody of the ancient king from Austria to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano. The stark contrast between those violent first days and his current existence is absolute. The battered time traveler now resides in a permanent, high-tech cryogenic purgatory specifically designed to artificially mimic the exact taphonomic conditions of the alpine glacier that held him tight for 5 millennia. He is permanently sealed within a highly specialized cold chamber kept at a constant -6 degrees Celsius with a relative humidity of exactly 98%. This extreme, relentless preservation strategy successfully halted the rapid aerobic decomposition that threatened to destroy him the very moment he was ripped from the ice. The crude butcher tools of early invasive autopsies have finally been banished from his presence forever. In their place, advanced digital forensics, high-resolution computed tomography scans, and precise three-dimensional surface mapping allow scientists to explore his deepest secrets without ever touching his fragile skin. The true face of Ötzi. Erasing a man's historical identity 5,000 years after his death is surprisingly easy when early biased assumptions write the official history books. For decades, the public was sold a comfortable, entirely fabricated illusion. Museums and textbooks presented Ötzi as a rugged, fair-skinned European mountain man with striking blue eyes and a wild mane of flowing hair. This image was instantly recognizable, fiercely defended by the establishment, and completely wrong. The original genetic studies from 2012 were severely compromised by modern DNA contamination, painting a picture that reflected the researchers more than the mummy himself. The official historical record remained uncorrected until a massive paradigm shift in 2023. Scientists executed a groundbreaking genomic revision, utilizing an unprecedented 15.3 times DNA coverage to meticulously filter out every trace of modern human interference. The results did not just tweak the existing narrative, they absolutely obliterated it. The raw genetic data stripped away the European mountain man myth and revealed the startling, true face of the ancient king. The new sequencing proved he possessed a skin tone among the darkest ever recorded in contemporary European individuals. The deeply tanned, leathery appearance of the mummy today is not simply an artifact of glacial freezing or thousands of years of mummification, as scientists incorrectly claimed for 30 years. That dark pigmentation was his natural living complexion. He gazed out at the hostile alpine environment, not with pale blue eyes, but with deep brown ones. Furthermore, his genetics dictated a severe predisposition for male pattern baldness. This biological reality perfectly explains the physical evidence found at the crime scene. Investigators recovered only sparse 9-centimeter locks of hair scattered near his frozen body, indicating he was likely balding heavily or possessed a severely receding hairline during his brutal final hours. The genomic data struck an even deeper blow to our understanding of human migration. Early theories aggressively pushed the idea that Ötzi possessed traits of steppe warriors, the nomadic herders who eventually swept across the continent. The pristine 2023 data wiped that theory completely off the map. There are zero detectable traces of steppe ancestry in his bloodline. Instead, the sequencing hit a staggering data point. Over 92% of his ancestry derives directly from early Anatolian farmers. This massive concentration is exponentially higher than any other European remains found from the Copper Age. This overwhelming genetic anomaly proves something deeply unsettling about his daily existence. Ötzi did not belong to a sprawling, interconnected civilization stretching across the fertile valleys below. He was actually a prominent member of a true, literal ghost population, completely forgotten by the long, unforgiving passage of recorded human history. His people formed an isolated, highly insular society completely walled off from the rest of the world by the sheer, impenetrable rock of the Alps. This massive geological barrier acted as an absolute genetic fortress, decisively blocking the natural flow of migrating tribes and fierce hunter-gatherer groups that were actively reshaping the cultural fabric of the rest of the continent. While mainland Europe was constantly churning with new migrating populations and rapidly blending bloodlines, Ötzi and his enigmatic people remained rigidly frozen in genetic time, completely cut off from the rapidly changing world swirling around them. A prehistoric biological crime scene. There is a persistent, deeply romanticized myth of the noble savage living in perfect, peaceful harmony with the pristine natural world. The physical reality of the Copper Age was relentlessly brutal, and the body of the ancient king serves as the ultimate proof. His mummified remains are not just an archaeological marvel, they constitute a literal biological crime scene, recording a lifetime of intense suffering at the hands of invisible, microscopic enemies. He did not live in a state of natural grace. He was locked in a constant, desperate battle for survival against pathogens that were slowly consuming him from the inside out. Through advanced proteomics and microscopic analysis, scientists have cataloged a terrifying list of chronic infections. He holds the grim distinction of being the absolute oldest known human case of Lyme disease. The ancient DNA of the tick-borne bacteria was found deeply embedded in his tissues, meaning he likely endured chronic joint pain, crippling fatigue, and severe neurological distress as he actively navigated the incredibly treacherous high-altitude terrain of the frozen mountains. As if that agonizing systemic infection was not enough to break a normal man, his digestive tract was completely ravaged by a severe, debilitating infestation of whipworm. These insidious, microscopic intestinal parasites violently attach themselves to the inner lining of his gut, silently leaching his vital nutrients and causing severe, unrelenting abdominal cramping and dangerous potential anemia over the span of many consecutive years. Yet the absolute most profound discovery buried deep within his internal organs is a massive historical bombshell that forces us to completely rewrite human migration patterns forever. Deep inside his mummified stomach contents, modern researchers reconstructed his exact microbiome and discovered a nearly pure, ancient Asian strain of the virulent bacterium Helicobacter pylori. Proteomic analysis confirmed the heavy presence of inflammatory proteins, proving that he was actively suffering from agonizing, bleeding gastritis at the very precise moment he died. This specific microscopic detail matters on a massive, global scale. Modern European populations universally carry a highly distinct, hybrid strain of this exact same stomach bacteria. The modern version is a complex genetic mix resulting from the collision of ancient Asian and African lineages. Textbooks have long confidently claimed that the sprawling, continent-shifting migrations responsible for blending these diverse populations and creating the modern world occurred long before the Copper Age. The undeniable physical presence of a pure, completely unmixed Asian bacterial strain inside the digestive tract of a native European who died 5,300 years ago completely shatters that firmly established academic timeline. It provides indisputable, hard biological evidence that the major waves of human migration that ultimately forged the genetic and microbial landscape of modern Europe had not yet occurred. Those world-altering population movements happened entirely centuries later than the official historical narrative rigidly insists. Instead of a highly interconnected ancient world, this ancient man lived in a profoundly isolated era. He was unknowingly carrying a primitive, highly volatile pathogen that was eventually eradicated entirely by the massive, sweeping tides of relentless human movement. Those massive migrations ultimately swallowed his completely forgotten alpine society, forcefully burying this horrifying biological truth far beneath the crushing, freezing weight of the glacial mountain ice until modern science finally dared to carefully dig it back out again. Ancient high-tech tactical gear. There is a deeply ingrained historical bias that views our ancient ancestors as simple, primitive creatures struggling blindly against the elements. You need to completely erase that image from your mind right now. When you examine the equipment found scattered around the frozen body of the ancient king, you are not looking at a random collection of primitive stone tools. You are looking at a highly advanced, proprietary system of ancient thermal engineering and tactical survival gear. We must break down his equipment exactly like a modern military loadout, because that is precisely the level of sophisticated functional design he carried into the high alpine death zone. The absolute pinnacle of his thermal engineering is clearly found in his remarkable footwear. These were never just crude leather wraps. They were highly complex, multiple-layered survival boots, specifically engineered for navigating extreme high-altitude snowy terrain. The heavy soles were constructed from incredibly thick bearskin to provide maximum traction and durability on the slick ice. The specialized uppers were carefully made from soft, flexible deerskin to aggressively repel heavy moisture. Inside this waterproof outer shell, he personally wove a complex internal netting structure using exceptionally strong lime tree bast fibers. This intricate internal net securely held a thick, tightly packed layer of dried grass, functioning as a high-performance insulating sock that completely trapped his radiating body heat. When modern survival experts actually built exact replicas of this specific footwear, the ancient design routinely outperformed premium modern tactical winter boots in freezing, brutal, snowy conditions. His offensive capabilities were equally staggering. He carried a massive 1.82-meter yew longbow, a terrifying weapon of devastating kinetic power. His surviving arrows featured complex fletching permanently attached at a precise, deliberate angle to intentionally induce a stabilizing spin during rapid flight, maximizing aerodynamic precision. To constantly guarantee his absolute survival in the freezing void, he resourcefully utilized insulated birch bark containers specially designed to safely carry smoldering live embers securely wrapped in fresh maple leaves, allowing him to instantly spark a critical, life-saving fire anywhere on the desolate glacier. Yet the absolute centerpiece of his entire tactical loadout remains the legendary copper axe. The flawlessly preserved blade is composed of exactly 99.7% pure copper, skillfully cold-hammered to severely harden the lethal cutting edge, and masterfully secured to a sturdy 60-centimeter yew-wood handle. For decades, traditional archaeologists stubbornly assumed this incredible ancient status symbol was simply forged from local alpine ore. Advanced lead isotope analysis completely destroyed that narrow assumption. The exact chemical signature of the heavy copper definitively proves the valuable metal did not originate anywhere near the snowy Alps. It was successfully mined in southern Tuscany, located well over 500 long kilometers away. This single, breathtaking realization completely redefines our fundamental understanding of the entire early Copper Age. A highly complex, intensely processed metallic material traveling over 500 brutal miles across treacherous prehistoric European landscapes provides undeniable proof of an incredible reality. It proves the undeniable existence of a massive, heavily hidden, high-tech continental trade network that conventional written history entirely forgot. This man was firmly plugged into a sprawling, sophisticated supply chain, bridging ancient Italian societies straight into the mountains, showcasing extreme genius. A prehistoric alpine murder investigation. There's a shift from passive historical observation to an active, high-stakes homicide investigation. For entirely too long, the broader scientific community confidently pushed a surprisingly simple, almost comforting narrative regarding his final moments on the frozen mountain. The official story claimed he was suddenly shot in the back by a rogue attacker, quickly bled out into the snow, and died almost instantly. The actual timeline of horrific violence is far more sinister and stretched out over several agonizing days. The true sequence of events begins long before that fatal arrow ever took flight. Investigators found the critical starting point of this prehistoric murder not on his back, but clearly visible on his right hand. Deep between his thumb and index finger lies a severe intravital cut that already showed active signs of early healing. Forensic experts universally classify this specific type of severe laceration as a classic defense wound. It strongly indicates he was locked in a brutal, desperate, close-quarters knife fight approximately 1 to 2 full days before his ultimate demise. He was aggressively fighting for his life, desperately attempting to grab or deflect a lethal incoming blade with his bare hands. The attacker clearly intended to inflict maximum physical damage during this sudden, chaotic onslaught. This violently traumatic encounter was the undeniable catalyst for everything that followed. The sheer terror of that brutal clash compelled the injured, bleeding king to frantically flee his home territory and rapidly ascend directly into the unforgiving, freezing death zone of the high Alps to desperately evade his relentless pursuers. He was terrified, exhausted, and bleeding as he navigated the treacherous terrain. But he was actively hunted. We can forensically track the exact trajectory of the sniper strike that finally brought him down. An unseen assassin launched a heavy, flint-tipped arrow from a highly concealed position situated slightly below and directly behind his fleeing target. The lethal projectile violently tore through the heavy layers of his protective animal skin clothing and smashed deep into his upper left shoulder. The razor-sharp flint arrowhead completely buried itself inside his body, violently slicing right through the critical left subclavian artery, which is the major blood vessel responsible for pumping vital oxygenated blood directly from the human heart down into the arm. When early radiological scans and detailed computed tomography imaging first revealed the sheer catastrophic extent of this massive internal arterial trauma, forensic pathologists immediately drew a seemingly logical conclusion. The presence of specific blood clotting proteins actively forming around the deep wound site strongly suggested a catastrophic, rapidly fatal event. The prevailing, undisputed scientific theory for many consecutive years confidently stated that this ancient survivor suffered massive, unstoppable internal hemorrhaging. The experts concluded that he rapidly bled to death, succumbing to total physiological shock and losing total consciousness within mere minutes of the devastating impact. It was neatly packaged as a swift, almost merciful end to a truly brutal, chaotic, and relentlessly terrifying prehistoric mountain chase. But advanced modern forensic science eventually caught up with that notoriously simple, outdated assumption, preparing to successfully and completely pull the very rug right out from under everything we had ever thought we knew about his terrifying final hours on that desolate, wind-swept, freezing alpine mountain. A slow and brutal demise. Forget everything you have been told about the final, fleeting seconds of the ancient king. The comforting, decades-old narrative of a swift, merciful death in the snow has been entirely dismantled. In the year 2025, scientists deployed unprecedented high-resolution computed tomography scans and advanced three-dimensional modeling that completely rewrote the definitive timeline of his final hours. The old theory of rapid exsanguination simply no longer fits the physical evidence left behind inside his mummified body. The established scientific consensus completely collapsed under this modern scrutiny. The breakthrough came when medical examiners zeroed in on a previously undetected pool of congealed blood. Deep between his scapula and his ribcage, they identified a distinct hematoma with a volume of exactly 110 milliliters. To put that precise measurement into perspective, 110 milliliters represents a mere 2% of a healthy adult human male's total blood volume. A sudden loss of that specific magnitude simply does not trigger immediate hemorrhagic shock. A human being does not die instantly from a 2% blood loss. The arterial damage was undeniably severe, yet it was not the immediate killer. Furthermore, precise forensic animation software meticulously mapped the exact trajectory of the flint arrowhead. The sophisticated digital models proved that the entry wound on his skin, the severe fracture on his shoulder blade, and the deep laceration on his subclavian artery only aligned perfectly if his body was contorted into one very specific, defensive anatomical posture at the exact moment of physical impact. This mathematical revelation drastically alters the accepted narrative. It proves definitively that he survived the initial devastating kinetic shock of the brutal sniper strike. He was severely injured and he was bleeding internally, but his heart kept beating. He lived for several more agonizing hours on that freezing mountain after the heavy arrow tore through his flesh. He remained conscious and desperately aware of his rapidly deteriorating condition in the cold. During those desperate, fading hours of agonizing survival, a massive secondary strike occurred. Advanced nanotechnology analysis of microscopic brain tissue samples confirmed severe, catastrophic trauma to both his skull and his fragile brain matter. This head injury was absolutely not the result of the incoming arrow. This massive blunt force trauma introduces a terrifying new sequence of violent events. The critical mystery remains whether his relentless attackers finally caught up to their wounded, bleeding prey, viciously bludgeoning him in the head to brutally finish the job, or if his violently failing body simply gave out from total exhaustion, causing him to collapse and violently smash his skull against the jagged, unforgiving alpine rocks. Either scenario paints a deeply disturbing final picture. He was not immediately killed by a solitary arrow from the dark shadows. He was actively hunted, severely maimed, and ultimately left violently broken and slowly dying in the absolute freezing isolation of the high mountain pass. His brutal demise was a prolonged nightmare of inescapable agony. The ice as the executioner. We must ultimately synthesize the brutal violence of his final days with the merciless reality of the high-altitude environment. At an elevation of 10,500 feet during the volatile shift of early spring, the desperate hunt finally came to a grueling end. The ancient king was stranded in the death zone, bleeding internally from a severely sliced subclavian artery and suffering from massive traumatic brain injury. His heavily damaged body simply could no longer generate the massive amounts of kinetic energy required to continue his desperate flight or maintain his core body temperature in the freezing wind. He collapsed into the deep snow, completely immobilized by his horrific physical trauma and total overwhelming exhaustion. This is where the environment took over the gruesome task his relentless pursuers had started. The biting cold did not simply arrive to act as a passive historical preserver for modern science to discover millennia later. The mountain ice acted as the ultimate merciless executioner. As he lay broken on the jagged rocks, the slow, creeping paralysis of severe hypothermia began to systematically shut down his remaining vital organs. The freezing temperatures violently stripped away his final shreds of conscious awareness, turning his own blood to ice and dragging him into an inescapable, frozen dark void. He endured a prolonged, agonizing period of profound physical suffering before the absolute zero of the alpine night finally extinguished his life forever. Yet, as the freezing wind buried his broken body, it also perfectly preserved the single most chilling mystery of this entire prehistoric homicide for us to carefully uncover today. We must deeply examine the terrifying motive behind this relentless and bloody pursuit. His killers successfully tracked him to the absolute top of the world. They shot him in the back with a lethal arrow. They likely stood directly over his paralyzed form and violently smashed his skull. After committing this incredibly brutal, highly coordinated act of extreme violence, the attackers simply walked away and deliberately left his most valuable possession sitting right there in the bloody snow without a single moment of hesitation. They completely abandoned the flawlessly crafted 99.7% pure copper axe. In the primitive economy of the Copper Age, that incredibly rare, highly advanced metallic weapon was a priceless artifact of supreme historical importance. It was a massive status symbol holding unimaginable material wealth and absolute power. Any opportunistic thief or desperate bandit would have immediately stripped that incredible treasure from his dying hands. The fact that the attackers intentionally left the priceless axe behind proves this was absolutely never a simple mugging. This was not a robbery motivated by prehistoric greed. This was a highly targeted, deeply personal assassination. We are ultimately looking at the dark and chilling aftermath of a vicious tribal vendetta, an ancient, unyielding blood feud permanently frozen in time, quietly echoing the enduring, brutal nature of human conflict across 5,000 incredibly long years of absolute, total silence.